Well, Trump was calmer than most people expected, and Hillary wants to spend, and spend more and more money. And by the way, we're all racist. I'm Dan Perkins.
Happiness is a new job for many Americans. I'm Don Mazzella.
It's time for Two Guys from Verona. Each week, you will hear from Dan Perkins, a financial expert, a regular columnist for the Hill website, and best-selling author, and Don Mazzella, a veteran journalist, author, and radio host talking about things that concern you politically, financially, and socially. They will also try to give listeners a heads up on future happenings.
Well, Don, tonight we have a special guest. We have a gentleman by the name of James Didio, who is a former deputy sheriff in Lee County near Fort Myers, Florida, and he wants to be the new head sheriff, and he wants to put more police on the street. I think it's important that we are in a unique position to have Jim on tonight because of what's been going on in Charlotte and what's been going on in the discussion about the police, even in the debate last night. So I know Jim has some pretty strong opinions. So Jim, welcome to Two Guys from Verona.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here, and it's great to talk with you guys tonight.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, sir.
If he has strong opinions, he'll work well in this show.
That's true. That's true. No wimps and no political correctness allowed in this show. Jim, you were on the sheriff's department for 10 years in Lee County, and you left. And tell us why you left and why do you want to come back?
Well, I can tell you that after being a deputy for so many years, trying to start a family in Southwest Florida as a cop is really hard. We hadn't received a raise in almost 10 years, and we were still at the $35,000 level. We're actually one of the lowest paid agencies in the state of Florida, $8,100 less than the other agencies there. So, when I decided to leave, it was monumental for me because, I love my job as a cop. I like helping people. There's many aspects of this job that I just absolutely loved. But when it came down to not being able to afford to raise a family and to get by with life, I had to make a significant change, and I went into the private sector of business on my own.
And from there, and then at some point in time, after you were in the private sector, what made you decide to run for sheriff?
Well, very shortly after I became a private business owner and learning, obviously the ups and downs of owning a business, which has been outstanding. I still own a business today. But I learned very quickly that I missed law enforcement, and a local small municipality took me back as a part-time officer to patrol the waterways of Southwest Florida, beautiful Southwest Florida, and also help with training and exercises out on the island with my knowledge and experience. With that being said, I still obviously paralleled the Lee County Sheriff's Office and watched every move and saw the same thing going on. And I said, listen, I'm going to step aside here and I'm going to take a crack at politics.
And so you decided to run as the independent candidate because of the Republican incumbent. I believe his name is Scott.
Yeah.
What do you see, Jim, as the differences between you and Sheriff Scott?
Sheriff Scott has done, an outstanding job. He's a 30-year law enforcement officer here in Lee County. He's a 12-year sheriff, but he is actually nearing his retirement. His Florida retirement system expires in less than 24 months, and for some reason he's running again. With that being said, we have followed a lackadaisical political type atmosphere at the sheriff's office that has affected employees. 53% of our employees have left due to resignation. Our budget's out of whack, and there's a love-hate relationship with that gentleman. And I just want to take it back to law enforcement and keep people safe, and that's my main goal. Is to fulfill that need in the law enforcement community, especially in today's age.
You did some. I'm sorry. Just one more question, Don. Then you can jump in. Not that I have it orchestrated. It just was on my lips as I was getting ready to say something. You ran an unusual campaign in that, as I understand it, you correct me if I'm wrong, you went out and talked to people. You listened to what the electorate was saying, whether it was in the rich white neighborhoods or the poor black neighborhoods.
Yeah.
What was there any commonality of what the concerns were, regardless of where it was in Lee County?
Well, I can tell you, to start off, being a non-party affiliated candidate, I'm able to reach out to everybody. The Democrats, Libertarians, the Independents, the Republican Party, and meet everybody, and that's been great. One common thing that everybody said, whether it was a national level or a local level, they were worried about their safety. It came from everything from Homeland Security all the way down to whether their car was going to get broken into at night. And those were major concerns of mine, especially, when you're talking about safety in a town that you grew up in a place that you're raising your family in. We do pretty well, but we're not in a gated community. So we have to look out for our own property, and I definitely want to keep up with safety and follow what they have a need for.
Okay, Don.
Well, I was going to ask him if you're going to expand the force, as you indicated, and raise the budget. How do you finance the county sheriff's office, and who's going to pay the bill?
Well, I can tell you, looking at these recent Charlotte riots and looking at other places around the nation, to see an agency which, has been called understaffed. It was an understaffed police force. The Lee County Sheriff's Office is understaffed by 110 already budgeted positions, okay? They're already paid for. The taxpayers have already been paying for them, and they've been paying for them for the last 3 budget years. This current sheriff is actually trying to raise the budget again another $20 million, and he keeps promising these new employees, but it's really, the hiring pool at $35,000 is very limited. We go through a vast number of applications and fly through them immediately. People can go to another agency with better qualifications and make double, triple the money right out of college. But we do have the money for 110 positions. It's going to take a sheriff to go out and actually recruit these guys from colleges, from high schools, anybody who's 18 and up, try to get them interested in law enforcement and interested in their community.
Jim, you said that, I think you said when we talked before the show, that there's about 1,700 employees in the Sheriff's Department in Lee County?
Yeah, we're budgeted for around 1,700. We're just under 1,600, really, depending on the day.
So the extra, what would you say, 110?
Yeah, about 110.
110 police officers are already budgeted, so there's no new tax revenue.
No.
The sheriff just hasn't. So let me ask you a question. How many officers out of that 1,700 or 1,600 employees are actually out patrolling as deputy sheriffs?
Well, our need is for somewhere around 400. And I can tell you that right now on the roads alone, between the districts and the shifts and the guys who actually hit the streets, we're looking at a number somewhere around, and sometimes less than 200 at a given time. That's low. That's low for us. That's lower than when I was there. It's lower when I started. Lower than when I started.
So what's the risk? What's the risk of having such a low, to the community? What's the risk of having such a low participation rate in the sheriff's department?
Well, I mean, it's an obvious thing, but something that's is safety. It's something that people don't really realize is that law enforcement, and my plan is to obviously enact a lot of community policing, and that means that you, Dan, living in Southwest Florida, you need you should know who patrols your street. Just like the old days when you knew that so-and-so was out there and even his son or his dad was a retired deputy and his son's going to be a deputy and so on. That's community policing. And when you have 200 deputies, when you're supposed to have 400 deputies or 350 or whatever the exact number is, you lose that. You lose the ability to reach out to the individual communities. All you're doing is answering calls and you're doing a reactive patrol. You're reacting to crime. You're not very proactive at all. And that's a huge risk in law enforcement.
So if you were to be elected sheriff, what do you think is a good number to have on the streets patrolling?
Like I said, I firmly believe that between district deputies on the road, the guys that you see in your police cars, and then the detectives, we need somewhere around 420. And the way that I look at this budget, we can do it, and we don't even have to ask for any more money.
Well, I guess my question is, why hasn't the incumbent done this?
Well, I can tell you that, like I said, the hiring pool is tough, and in recent years, being such a political guy, as I said before, not a bad guy, but highly political, he's done a lot of promotions. We have a number of administrative deputies who carry a gun and a badge that are getting paid sometimes triple what it would cost to have a new deputy on the road. So that's 3 deputies in one guy, and this one guy, he's an administrator. And you know how administrators are, 30 years in, they're public service guys, as we use quotation marks, and they don't really do a whole lot. They're the guys who are, they're doing safety classes here and there, and that's about it 5 days a week. We need guys on the street. And that's very important, and he's not doing that.
Your number, if I can do the math right, is if there's 1,600 or so people in the sheriff's department, 200 on the road, 200,
right.
225. Are you saying there's almost 1,400 bureaucrats?
Well, we do run our jails, and we have a little bit of the equal amount of jail deputies, administrators over there, and we also run our court systems. So if you think about that and you take a look at the deputy to civilian ratio, we do have less law enforcement than we do civilians. We have a lot more civilians, and in actuality, the recent step plan was given to the civilian personnel, in which they know where they're going to be in a couple of years via raises. In fact, they've received more raises than certified law enforcement officers. And I look at this thing 10 times from Sunday, and I can't figure out how or why this is happening.
So let's go to Charlotte.
Okay.
As a person very working part-time, interested in becoming sheriff, and what have you seen that might have implications for Lee County, and what would you do as sheriff to make it safe?
Well, you look at a place like Charlotte, and obviously we're watching the news media, right? And it looks like it's mayhem down there. It's looking crazy. And when in actuality it was 4 square blocks. Now, my wife went to Appalachian State University, and we've spent many good times up in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I've been through those streets, and we have close family and friends that live there. But bringing it back to Lee County, I kept thinking as I watched all these riots throughout the past couple of years, I was trained in field force, crowd control, and riot management. I was on a specialized team for a number of years, and, we were actually considered unnecessary by our current sheriff, and he refused to pay us for any, time spent in official training, and it really baffled me. So a lot of people had dropped out of that. So it's clear that we must prepare and be ready in the event that this takes place in our county. We're going to have, as a sheriff, I'm going to have an implemented, creative, and highly trained plan with a foolproof outcome if this ever happens in our community. We need to maintain law and order while investigations are being conducted. I mean, that's just the downright of it, because these guys are acting, these rioters seem to act hours after the gunshots go off. And that's limiting our ability to actually take a look at this thing and find out what's going on. People are already coming to conclusions.
You're absolutely right. I was in Boston this weekend, and I was talking to a Boston police captain about this and that. And he said the blacks get the first shot now. Police fear.
Yeah.
Would you want to comment on that at all?
Well, I mean, I think about that because in training and coming up, that had been said, and it's not the first time that I've heard that. And we think of who takes the first shot as something in the military, such as rules of engagement. Well, in law enforcement, we define our rules of engagement as a use of force continuum. And listen, we're trained to go home at night. We face every type of evil out on these streets. And when a person doesn't follow basic commands, he won't show his hand, or even he pulls a weapon. We call this an increased force response. Does every situation mean that someone gets shot? No. But let me bring it home for the listeners here. I've been a cop for 10 years, and I've pulled my gun, but I've never shot anyone, and I don't want to shoot anybody. I absolutely, unequivocally want to go home at the end of my shift with my 2 young children and my beautiful wife. I do this to save lives and to create a better world. As it does, every other cop wearing the badge thinks this same thing. I respect your life just as much as my own. But I'll tell you what, if a guy's going to pull a gun on me, I hope I can get the gun out quicker. And that's just the way that like I said, I just want to go home at the end of the night.
So we've got about 30 seconds, Jim.
Great.
Why do you think the people of Lee County should hire Jim?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I'm running for sheriff to make our homes safe for all people in Lee County. I want to represent everybody in Lee County and make sure, because it is my job, it is what I'm trained to do, is to keep you safe during the day and at night. And that's my whole main goal here.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for spending part of your evening with us, and good luck to you in your November race, and maybe we'll talk to you again.
Hey, Dan, Don, thank you guys, and have a good night.
You too.
Bye.
This is Dan Perkins.
And Don Mazzella.
We're the Two Guys from Verona. Go to our website, twoguysfromverona.com, and we'll be right back after these messages from our sponsor.
Welcome back. You're listening to Two Guys from Verona. Once again, here's your hosts, Dan Perkins and Don Mazzella.
Well, this is Don Mazzella, and we're turning the tables a little bit on Dan tonight because he sat and watched the debate last night, which 80-odd million Americans did, which is still less than the 100 million that they expected. But anyway, I want to ask him, what were the 5 things you saw or heard or did in the last 24 hours about the debate?
Well, that's a good question. One, I think, is that Mr. Trump didn't blow up. A couple of times he got pretty heated when they went after him, but he didn't blow up. I thought his law and order comment was appropriate. Hillary basically changed her tune when she put 25% of half of all of Trump's supporters in the basket of incorrigibles and racists and sexists and homophobes. Last night she said everybody in America is basically racist, which I thought was way out of line. I thought that the commentator was out of line, Lester Holt. He clearly asked more follow-up questions to Mr. Trump, argued with him over stop and frisk, argued with him over his taxes, argued with him on some other things. He had no confrontations with Hillary whatsoever. And I think that the other thing I concluded was that how is it possible to continue these kind of debates when you select a moderator who has a bias towards one candidate or the other? Clearly, Mr. Holt favored Mrs. Clinton, and as a result, Mr. Trump was somewhat on the defensive. I think he also showed that he is presidential. He took all the crap from her, and he continued. He gave some back, not as much as I would like to have seen him. But he said today that when he thought about what he was going to do in the debates, he didn't necessarily think that it would be appropriate for him to be hard on her. The thing that surprised me, that Mr. Holt raised no questions about Benghazi, emails, or the Clinton Foundation. To this moment, I don't understand why. There are some people, including my dear wife, who thought that Trump should have raised those questions, but that remains to be seen. He said this morning on Fox and Friends that he's going to be a different person in future debates. What were your 5 or 3 or 2 or 1?
Well, I only have 2 basic ones. One is that in the parlance of my wife, he got the ball over the net, which is all he really needed to do. And since we talked earlier, I've thought about something, and I happen to hear Mike Francesca, who happens to be a sports announcer in New York.
Yeah, WFAN.
Yeah. But he said a very interesting thing. He said Hillary had a bad month in September. Trump had one in August, but now they're dead even, and it looks as if this race will go down to the wire. But then he got a caller who said, close, it's not even close. Trump is pulling away. And Mike, who's clearly a Hillary person, humped his way around it. But I'm getting the sense, and I'm looking forward to the next set of polls, but I am getting the sense that if the best the media can say is that they're even, it must mean that he's ahead. I think this is going to be a sprint to the White House, but until, and I know we disagree on this point, someone comes up with a simple message like a chicken in every pot about the economy. That's why I started off. Happiness is finding a job. There are millions of Americans out of work, and the next president has got to find ways to put them back to work, short of war. Back to you, Dan.
Well, obviously, I think I agree with you, short of war, but I'm not so sure that we're not going to have one, at least with ISIL. The idea that we have these kind of situations, I have said to you on this show many times that I believe that the pollsters are out of touch with the people outside of New York, Boston, New York, Washington, and LA. Excuse me. I absolutely believe that. And I looked at the polling data this morning. CNN had a huge win for Hillary, but they, at least this time, were smart enough to announce that they overweighted Democrats by 25% in their polls. All the other polls that I saw from all over the country had Trump winning handily. And I think it's because the people away from New York, Washington, and LA are the people that are looking at it and saying, I want to change. And Hillary represents 30 years of the same old thing and no success. She's not been successful at her 30 years in public life. What has she done for the American people? Not much. So we got about 30 seconds here. I think that the next debate, which will be the vice president's, will be interesting. The next presidential debate will be a town meeting format where the audience gets to ask the questions as opposed to a moderator. And I harken back to the command debate with Matt Lauer, where they weren't on the stage together, but they were asked questions separately by the audience. And the reaction to that guy, the former intelligence officer who said he would have been in jail for a hell of a lot less than what she did, and why shouldn't she be in jail for what she did? I suspect, unless Hillary can get to the questioners and skew the questions towards her, that will be a much more difficult format for her. And then the last presidential debate is with Chris Wallace from Fox News. And with that, we need to take a break. I'm Dan Perkins.
Don Mazzella.
We're the two guys from Verona. Remember, if it's important to you, it's important to us. And we'll be right back after these commercial messages.
Welcome back. You're listening to Two Guys from Verona. Once again, here's your hosts, Dan Perkins and Don Mazzella.
You know, Dan, there used to be a Depression-era song called Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? And it really talked to the question of looking for a job. As I said earlier, I was up in Boston, and I passed a street corner where I saw a group of men gathered. And what they were gathered for, it was Sunday, was to get temporary jobs during the charity march, the walk for Jimmy Cancer. And I started to talk to them. You know me, I go out and talk to a lot of people.
Good.
And most of them were not homeless. They had jobs, but they were there because they needed the extra money. but they were happy to have jobs. What is it? Something like 90 million Americans do not have a full.
94.5 million.
94.5 million Americans. Yet our presidential candidates are not talking about it in the way that's heard. In Roosevelt's campaign, he said a chicken in every pot. I'm waiting for one or the other of the candidates to come up with a slogan that represents their direction to get this country out of the malaise it's in. The economy is not good. On my small business program, I had a man come on who said, despite Hillary Clinton's protest, he said the economy is bad, and I had to cut the prices of my products. Now that was, I thought, a very interesting point. It happened to be a toy product, and he pointed out that he had to take his price point down from $29.95 to $19.95. He said because in today's world, people buy toy gifts like his at price point. But at the same token, we saw another group of products that were between 100. There were robot products between $150 and $350. Wow. And I was wondering who could afford that, but apparently people can. Well, I'm getting a little off track, but I just want to say Americans today need jobs, and we've got to figure a way of getting those jobs without, how should we say, dumbing them down.
Yeah.
Back to you.
Yeah, there was a piece I did a couple of weeks ago, or a week or so ago, on jobs. We have about 12 million manufacturing jobs in the United States. We have, between state, city, county, and federal employees, 22 million government employees. So we have almost twice as many government employees who don't produce anything but paperwork and legislation and regulations versus manufacturing jobs. It's amazing that we have destroyed our manufacturing sector. Recently, Mr. Trump talked about what was going on in Michigan with Ford moving all of its small automobile manufacturing to Mexico. And the chairman of Ford somewhat pushed back and said, well, we're not eliminating any jobs in Michigan. And that was a true statement, but he's adding 3,000 jobs in Mexico and spending $1.5 billion to build a plant there to make these automobiles. Trump's contention last night, and interestingly enough, Trump's contention last night was that when we ship an item into Mexico, Mexico puts a value-added tax of about 17%. When Mexico ships an item into the United States, we charge no tax. The same thing is true of most of the both European and Asian trading partners. Anything that comes out of China comes into the United States without a tax. Anything we ship out of the United States to China is taxed in China before it comes in. What's interesting, though, is that last week, one of the previous ministers in the Mexican government, I think it was the finance minister, said that he believed that Mexico was in fact going to pay for the wall because Trump was going to impose border crossing fees for individuals, for trucks. He's going to add a value-added tax for imports coming in from Mexico, and the proceeds of that money will initially go to pay for the wall. And he said it in such a way as that the realization was that Mexico has had an advantage for decades at the expense of the United States, and that they're going to have to pay. And I think it's interesting that even one of the former Mexican finance ministers understands that Mexico is in fact going to pay for the wall.
Yeah, but then he was repudiated by the president of Mexico a week later. And if you recall, under NAFTA, we cannot tax the trucks or the transportation of those items. We can tax if we choose, like they do in Mexico, the excise tax, but we chose not to. Mexico does and we don't. But we can't put a tax on the trucks according to NAFTA. Sometimes Trump has the right idea, but I don't think he does the research necessary to know what he can and can't do.
Yeah, but see,
of course,
where I disagree with you is that what Trump said, we need to renegotiate NAFTA to bring it in balance so it's fair to Mexico and it's fair to the United States. And my guess is if the Republicans control the House and the Senate and the White House, that renegotiation will be a hell of a lot easier. And I see by the clock on the wall we have to take another break. So this is Dan Perkins.
Oh, you're going to have to say Don Mazzella. That's okay.
And we'll be right back after these commercial messages.
You're listening to Two Guys from Verona. In this final segment, Don and Dan offer their predictions on what's going to happen in our world.
Well, as if I didn't have anything to do, you know, I write for The Hill, The Daily Caller. I write for ReaganBaby.com, The Daily Surge, and for Clash Daily. Well, I've added another one. I'm started as of last Friday writing for The Constitution. They have about 2.5 to 2.7 million page views a month and growing rapidly. So my first piece was last Friday, but I want to talk about the piece that was published yesterday, which I thought was apropos to the presidential debate. The title of the piece was, What Would Martin Luther King Jr. say about his brothers and sisters today? What I wanted to do was to follow up what Mr. Trump has been saying in the black community across the nation about the Democrats, and the Democrats who've had control of the major cities from anywhere from 50 to 100 years. That really shook me, that the Democrats have had control of a city in the United States for 100 years. And Donald talked about the promises that were made to the black community in Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. In the piece, I talk about the fact that in the period of time from the signing of and the implementation of the War on Poverty, the American government has spent more money than the money spent on all wars in the history of this nation. $22 trillion has been spent on the War on Poverty. Now, there's no doubt that there have been some significant success stories of blacks and Hispanics who've come out of the inner city and gone on to greatness. Colin Powell or Condoleezza Rice or many other people. But we have a situation where I contend that the Democrats have made a presumption. And the piece that I'm working on right now that's waiting to be circulated, the title of that piece says Hillary Clinton to Mr. Trump, I own those Mexicans and colored voters. Leave them alone. You see, for a long period of time, the Democrats have controlled the colored or the black or the African American, however they're characterized, by making promises and making the government the supporter of the household. The War on Poverty Act basically replaced the black male in the household with the American government providing the substance for the family to try and survive. And what's happened is that we have a situation where the black community has seen very little progress in the last 50 years since the War on Poverty. Martin Luther King wondered about the checks that were supposed to being written to support the black community coming back with insufficient funds, except we spent $22 trillion on the inner city communities. We have looked at what's going on, and Mr. Trump has been going around the country at black churches and black community organizations, and he's saying to those people, what do you got to lose to vote for me? How have you been treated over the last 50 years? You look at the murder rates in Chicago and in Philadelphia and Baltimore, and what's going on in Charlotte and other cities. What you're seeing is the reaction by the black community to the oppression that they've had for 50 years. And every 4 years the Democrats promise, but they don't deliver, but they come back 4 years later. And so Mrs. Clinton has presumed that the black community will vote for her en masse, and I believe that this may be the very first time that the black community will in fact not vote en masse for the Democratic candidate. Don?
Well, as you know, I work for Essence magazine, the black woman's magazine, and got a terrific look inside the black community on many levels. Interesting statistic told to me by the CFO of the company, who happened to be white. 73% of the women at Essence were not married and had children. It just shocked me with doing that. But and it kind of points out, and these are all professional women, by the way. Most of them were professional journalists, etc., salespeople. Anyway, it points out what you're saying. I can only go along with most of what you're saying. I had a class at NYU with Herman Hillman. Most people don't know who he was, but for 20 years he was the housing czar of America in the Harry Truman administration, and even into Dwight Eisenhower. And this was the late 40s and early 50s, when they took out whole swatches of cities and built the towering apartment buildings for low-income people.
Ghetto housing.
Yes. And it was interesting. This in 1965. I'm talking to him. He's an old man. And I wasn't talking to him. I was listening to him in class. And he pointed out, he said, what we simply did is we ghettoized, as you just put it, put them in one place.
Right.
And we will pay the penalty.
Yep.
By the time he died, he was a pariah in the liberal community. But he wasn't wrong.
Right.
Nothing you said tonight, Dan, about any of this is wrong. I'll go back to you.
Two things for real quick. The Center for Disease Control, I don't know why they're reporting it, but they reported that for 2015, 40% of the live births in the United States in 2015 were out of wedlock. In addition, the black community represents approximately 13% of the population of this nation. They had 37% of the abortions. And in New York City, there are more black abortions than there are in live births. The genocide in the inner cities and the murders and the abortion rate is killing the black population. So we need to take a break here, and I guess we go back to Don, and you're going to talk about North Carolina or North Korea.
Well, I can talk about North Carolina too, but I'd much rather talk. I had a briefing over the weekend up in I was in the Boston area from a group of scientist advisors, and there was a book many years ago called Alas Babylon, which essentially was America under attack and what happens to people in it. And what precipitated the nuclear holocaust was that Syria threw an atom bomb at Israel. Right now, North Korea sits very close. As you may have read, they said they were building a rocket to the moon really, if you look at it, they're really trying to build a rocket to Washington. In the next 3 months or 4 months, it is very possible that we will have something happen from North Korea. It is something we fear. And the unfortunate part is that the Chinese are not doing anything to prevent it. Yes, if you read the Wall Street Journal, you learned on Friday that they're cracking down on a trans-border company, but that's after the horse left the barn. North Korea is rapidly approaching the point where they will be not a threat, but a murder alliance that will kill many Americans. They'll lose eventually, but in the process, millions of Americans may die. Back to you.
Well, interesting you mentioned that, because last night in the presidential debate, Mr. Trump said to Mrs. Clinton, "I know that you think that global warming is the greatest threat to the world, but let me tell you, I believe that the greatest threat to the world is nuclear proliferation, much more so than global warming." And she didn't really have a comeback for that. I think he's right. I as the author of the Brotherhood of the Red Nile trilogy of radical Islamic nuclear terrorism, I am convinced that if a terrorist group can get their hands on 1 or 2 bombs, they're going to bring them into the United States. And until we secure that border, that's where they're going to come in, and they're going to attack us, and they're going to kill tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Americans. And people are going to wonder, what in the world happened? How did this happen? It happened because without defining a border, you don't have a nation. And I think Go ahead.
Well, let me just interrupt you. One of the side treaties that Kerry and Putin are working on is the fact that the Americans want the Russians to be more firmly controlling of their nuclear weapons. And there's some pushback on the Russian side, but they seem to be seeing the light, according to intelligence officials, because they too are worried. They can put a bomb to the United States just as easy as they can put a bomb in Russia.
Yeah.
That's what I want to bring up.
Okay, we're at about 10 seconds. So Dan Perkins.
Don Mazzella.
We're the 2 guys from Verona. Thanks for listening. And join us next week on following the vice presidential debate.
You've been listening to 2 Guys from Verona.